The world is thawing. Great walls of ice that ruled for millennia begin to weep. Forests creep northward, animals stir from frozen silence, and humankind stands at the fragile edge of change. This is the story of survival, of memory etched in ice, and bone a time when the world was half asleep, half awakening. Tonight, you will journey back to the dawn of warmth, the birth of hope, and the haunting beauty of the melting world. In the time before memory, when the world wore only white, there stretched a silence so complete it seemed to hold its breath. The great ice sheets reached beyond the horizon, their surfaces carved by winds that had blown for 10,000 years without pause. Here, in this realm of endless twilight, the sky hung low and grey, pregnant with snow that never quite fell, as if even the clouds had forgotten how to let go. The glaciers rose like the ribs of some sleeping giant, their faces blue as midnight water, groaned and cracked with sounds that echoed across the emptiness like the songs of whales in an empty sea. Between these titans of ice, valleys lay buried beneath snow so deep that mountains became mere hills, and hills became gentle slopes that rolled on forever, unmarked by any footprints save those of the wind. But in one small fold of this frozen world, where a cliff face turned its back to the endless plain, there flickered a light. It was tiny, no bigger than a child's cupped hands, yet in this universe of white and grey, it burned like a star fallen to earth. The light came from within a cave, a hollow worn into the rock by waters that had flowed here when the world was young and warm, waters that now slept as ice in the depths of the earth. Within this sanctuary, where the stone walls wept with frost and the air itself seemed thick with cold, a family huddled around their fire. 7 souls in all, 2 elders whose hair had long since turned the color of winter, a man and woman in the strength of their years, 2 children who had known no world but this one, and an infant who slept bundled in furs so thick she seemed more bare than human. The fire at their center burned with the patience of the ancient. Each stick of wood was precious, gathered from the rare twisted trees that somehow survived in the lee of the great stones, their branches brittle as old bones but burning with a slow, steady heat that could stretch a single log through a long night. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shadows that moved like living things across the cave walls, where ancient hands had painted the memory of animals that once roamed free, mammoth and horse, bison and cave bear, all rendered in ochre and charcoal, all gone now beneath the ice. The woman, Aya, tended the fire with movements as deliberate as prayer. Each adjustment of the burning wood was a ritual, each ember coaxed back to life, a small victory against the cold that pressed against their shelter like a living thing. Her hands, darkened by soot and hardened by countless seasons, knew the language of flame and fuel, the delicate balance between heat and consumption that meant the difference between life and the long sleep from which there was no waking. Beside her, the man they called Thane worked quietly at a spear tip, napping flint with small, precise strikes. The sound of stone on stone punctuated the soft whisper of the fire, a rhythm as old as humanity itself. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, never left his work, but his ears remained always open to the world beyond their shelter, listening for the crack of ice that might signal danger, the distant call of the great white bears that sometimes wandered close, or the other sounds that sometimes came in the deep of night, sounds they could not name and did not speak of. The children sat close to the fire, their eyes wide with the particular wonder of those who have never seen the world any other way. To them, this cave was the universe, the fire, its sun, and the stories told here in the long hours of darkness were the laws by which all things moved. The eldest child, a boy of perhaps 8 winters, held a piece of carved bone in his hands, the figure of a horse, its mane flowing as if it ran forever through an invisible wind. He had never seen such a creature, but the dreams that came to him in sleep were filled with them, running across green plains, under a bright sun that he had no words to describe. The elders sat in the place of honor closest to the fire, their weathered faces serene with the deep peace of those who have survived long enough to understand the true nature of endurance. The old woman, Naya, held the infant against her chest, her voice rising and falling in a lullaby, older than the ice itself, words in a language that predated speech, sounds that spoke directly to the places in the heart where fear lived, soothing them into stillness. Outside their sanctuary, The wind sang its ancient song, a wordless music that spoke of vastness and time, of the slow dance of seasons that had forgotten how to change. It rattled the hide that served as their door, sending small spirals of snow across the cave floor, where they melted and hissed against the warm stones around the fire pit. This was their world: flame and stone, fur and flesh, the careful conservation of warmth and food and hope. Each day was an act of quiet defiance against the endless winter. Each night, a small death and resurrection, as they banked their fire and trusted that morning would find them still breathing. They had no calendar, but the rhythm of their own needs, hunger and satisfaction, waking and sleep, the slow accumulation of days that stretched into seasons without meaning. Yet tonight, as the fire burned lower and the cave grew thick with the breath of sleeping humans, there was something different in the air. Perhaps it was in the way the wind sounded, carrying within its endless voice a note that had not been there before. Perhaps it was in the dreams that came to them as they slept, dreams touched with colors that had no names, with warmth that felt like remembering something long forgotten. The fire settled into embers, its light growing soft and red, and still it burned as it had burned for generations, as it would burn for generations yet to come. For in this time before time, in this place between places, the flame was more than light or warmth. It was the promise that dawn would come again, even to a world that had forgotten what dawn meant. The morning came without color, as all mornings had for longer than memory could reach. The light that seeped through the hide covering of their cave entrance was gray and diffuse, filtered through clouds so thick they seemed solid, a ceiling of ash suspended just above the earth. Yet for those who lived beneath this eternal twilight, it was morning nonetheless, the time when breath came easier, and the world beyond their shelter called to them, with its familiar dangers and necessary gifts. Thane woke first, as he always did, his body attuned to rhythms older than consciousness. In the blue hour before full waking, he lay still and listened. The wind had quieted during the night, settling into the deep, steady breathing of winter at rest. No crack of shifting ice spoke of immediate danger. No padding footsteps suggested the great white hunters had found their scent. The world beyond was as it should be: silent, vast, and waiting. He rose carefully, his movements practiced in the art of preserving warmth. Each fold of fur, each positioning of limb, was calculated to hold the precious heat his body had generated through the night. The cave floor was cold enough to steal breath through the thickest hide boots, but Thane moved across it as if walking on sacred ground. Each step, a meditation on the simple miracle of being alive in a world that did not welcome life. The fire had burned low, but not out a small success that filled him with quiet satisfaction. He fed it carefully, adding thin pieces of birch bark that would catch quickly, then larger twigs that would sustain the flame until proper wood could be added. The fire responded to his attention like a living thing, blooming into brightness that pushed back the shadows and brought the painted walls to life once more. Aya stirred as the warmth reached her, her own rhythms synchronized to the fire's growth. She moved like water, flowing from sleep to waking without the jarring transition that marked the nights when dreams brought visions of the green world. Today, her sleep had been deep and still, filled with the kind of darkness that restored rather than haunted. "The wind has gentled," she said, her voice soft in deference to those still sleeping. It was their first gift to each other each morning, the sharing of what the night had brought, the reading of signs that would shape their day. Thane nodded, adding a larger piece of wood to the fire. "The sky holds snow, but not for today. Today we hunt." It was a decision made not from confidence, but from necessity. Their stores of dried meat had dwindled to portions that could sustain them for perhaps 10 more days, and the ptarmigan snares they had set in the shelter of wind-carved stones had yielded nothing for 3 days running. In the endless mathematics of survival, this meant risk was now a luxury they could not afford. The children woke with the particular alertness of those whose lives had been shaped by the understanding that each day might demand everything they had learned. The boy, Kale, sat up and immediately looked to the fire, reading its strength and mood as others might read a face. The girl, Vera, younger by 2 winters, remained curled in her furs, but opened eyes that missed nothing. The set of her father's shoulders, the way her mother's hands moved through the familiar rituals of preparation, the quality of light that leaked through their shelter's entrance. The elders woke, last but most fully, emerging from sleep with the unhurried completeness of those who had long ago learned the difference between rest and refuge. Old Harrick stretched joints that spoke of countless winters with small pops and sighs, while Naya cradled the infant and began the soft humming that would ease the child's transition from night to day. "The ancestors walked with me last night," Naya said, her voice carrying the particular cadence reserved for the sharing of dreams. In their world, dreams were not private visions, but messages meant for the whole family, wisdom that belonged to all who shared the fire's warmth. They listened as she spoke of vast herds moving across endless plains, of rivers that flowed bright as silver under a sun too brilliant to look upon, of trees so tall their tops were lost in clouds soft as new snow. But woven through these visions of abundance were shadows, great shapes moving beneath ice too thick to see through, restless stirrings that spoke of change approaching like a distant storm. "The ice dreams of moving," she concluded, her weathered hands still gentle on the baby's bundled form. "But dreams and waking are not the same thing. Today, we work with what we know." The morning meal was brief and efficient: strips of dried caribou, bitter tea brewed from needles they had gathered before the last storm, fat that provided the dense energy their bodies craved in this world that stole warmth with every breath. They ate in the companionable silence of those who had shared such meals through countless mornings, each person focused on their own internal preparation for what the day would demand. Thane began the ritual of preparing for the hunt, checking his spear points, testing the balance of his throwing stick, wrapping his feet in additional layers of hide and fur that would let him move silently across snow that could betray the unwary with a sound like breaking bones. His movements were economical, each action refined by years of practice into a smooth sequence that wasted neither motion nor attention. Aya prepared in her own way, gathering the tools she would need to check their snares and perhaps dig for the cached roots that sometimes survived beneath the snow in the shelter of the great stones. Her work was no less vital than the hunt in their world. Survival was built from 1,000 small successes, rather than a few great ones. The children would remain with the elders, but their day would not be idle. KL would practice with his child-sized spear, learning the precise movements that might one day mean the difference between eating and starving. Vera would work on scraping hides, her small hands growing strong and skilled at the endless tasks that turned raw materials into the tools and clothing their life required. As Thane and Aya prepared to face the day's challenges, the fire settled into its patient burning, the light that would guide them home, regardless of what the frozen world beyond chose to offer or withhold. Outside, the vast silence waited, not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities that existed in the delicate balance between hope and caution that defined their every moment. The hide door lifted, admitting a breath of air so cold it seemed to steal thoughts from the mind. But with it came something else, a scent that was not quite familiar, a quality to the light that suggested, perhaps, that this day might hold something different from all the days that had come before. They stepped into the white world, leaving the cave's warmth behind, but carrying its promise with them, that no matter what the endless winter demanded of them, they would return to this place of fire and safety, this small victory against the vast indifference of ice and sky. In the deepest heart of winter, when even the wind seemed too tired to blow, and the world held its breath beneath a weight of snow that had been falling for 7 days without cease, the pains began. They came to Aya like waves against a distant shore, gentle at first, then growing in strength until they commanded her complete attention, until the cave around her became nothing more than a blurred backdrop to the ancient drama unfolding within her body. Naya had been expecting this. The old woman moved with the quiet efficiency of one who had welcomed new life into the world more times than memory could count, her weathered hands sure and gentle as she prepared for the work ahead. She heated stones in the fire until they glowed like small suns, then wrapped them in soft hides that would hold warmth close to Aya's laboring body. She brewed tea from herbs she had saved through many seasons, precious leaves, and roots that held within them the concentrated essence of summer, the power to ease pain and strengthen blood. The storm outside, seemed to sense what was happening within the cave, and it responded with a violence that shook the very stone around them. Wind howled through cracks they had never noticed before, sending spirals of snow across the floor where they hissed and died against the heated stones. The hide that covered their entrance strained against its bindings like a living thing trying to escape, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, ice cracked with sounds, like thunder rolling across the frozen plains. Thane paced at the far edge of the fire's light, his usual calm fractured by the primitive helplessness that overcame even the strongest when faced with mysteries beyond their control. He had faced charging mammoth without fear, had tracked wounded cave bears through blizzards that could blind and kill. But this was a realm where his skills meant nothing, where only the ancient wisdom of women could guide them through. The children huddled together, their eyes wide, with an emotion that was equal parts wonder and terror. They had never witnessed this process before, had never heard their mother's voice rise and fall in the particular rhythm of labor, had never seen their grandmother's face set with the fierce concentration of one who holds life and death in her hands. Kael gripped his carved horse so tightly his knuckles showed white even in the firelight, while Vera pressed herself against old Harek's side, drawing comfort from his steady presence. As the hours passed and the storm's fury seemed to merge with the rhythm of birth itself, strange things began to happen. The fire, which had been burning with its usual patient steadiness, suddenly flared higher than it had ever burned before, its flames reaching toward the cave ceiling with tongues of gold and crimson that cast dancing shadows like living spirits on the painted walls. The ancient animals seemed to move in the flickering light, mammoth trumpeting silently, horses galloping across stone plains, bears rising on their hind legs to welcome some unseen dawn. Harek watched this with eyes that had seen many wonders but none quite like this. In his long life, he had learned to read signs in all things, in the way snow fell, in the patterns birds made as they flew, in the dreams that came in the deep of night. And what he saw now in the fire's strange behavior, in the storm's fierce blessing, told him that this birth was touched by something beyond the ordinary, something that spoke of changes coming like the first stirrings of a long-awaited spring. The moment came, as all such moments do, suddenly, despite the long preparation, with a rush of sensation and emotion that seemed to compress eternity into a single heartbeat. Aya's final cry mingled with the wind's howling, and then there was another voice in the cave, thin, clear, and impossibly strong for something so small and new. The baby's first breath drew in the smoke-scented air, and let it out again in a wail that seemed to acknowledge both the hardship of the world she had entered, and her determination to claim her place within it. Naya lifted the child toward the fire's light, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The flames, which had been dancing so wildly just moments before, suddenly gentled into a glow so soft and steady, it seemed almost like sunlight. The baby's cries quieted as the warmth reached her, and she opened eyes that reflected the fire's light like tiny mirrors, seeming to look directly at the dancing flames, with an expression of recognition rather than newborn confusion. "She is kissed by fire," Naya whispered, using words that came from the oldest part of their language, words that spoke of prophecies and promises older than the ice itself. Born in storm, blessed by flame, this one carries warmth within her. As if in response to these words, the baby's tiny fist uncurled, revealing a palm that seemed almost to glow in the firelight. When Naya placed the child against Aya's breast for the first time, the exhausted mother's face transformed with a wonder that had nothing to do with the ordinary miracle of new life, and everything to do with the sense that they had been chosen for something beyond their understanding. The storm outside began to quiet, its rage spent as suddenly as it had risen. In the growing stillness, they could hear sounds they had not noticed before: the gentle hiss of snow settling against the cave entrance, the soft pop of stones cooling in the fire pit, their own heartbeats slowing from the frantic rhythm of crisis to the steady pulse of renewed hope. Thane approached slowly, his movements careful and reverent. When he looked down at his newest daughter, he saw something in her face that made him think of summer, not the harsh, brief summers he had known in his youth, but the deeper summer that lived in the oldest stories, the time when the whole world bloomed with warmth and plenty. Her hair was dark as rich earth, her skin glowed with health, and her eyes held depths that seemed far too knowing for one so new to the world. They named her Ember, for the way she seemed to hold fire within herself. and for the hope she represented that even in the deepest cold, warmth could survive, could grow, could eventually kindle into something larger than itself. As they passed her carefully from hand to hand, letting each member of their family welcome her properly, the baby remained calm and alert, her gaze moving from face to face, as if memorizing each one, as if understanding that these people would be her anchor in a world that offered little certainty beyond the promise of endless cold. But even as they celebrated this new life, each of them felt the presence of something larger stirring around them. The storm's sudden fury and equally sudden calm, the fire's strange behavior, the sense of watching eyes that seemed to peer at them from the darkness beyond their shelter's walls. All of it spoke of a world in transition, of forces awakening, that had slept beneath the ice for longer than human memory could reach. Outside, the first stars began to appear, through the breaking clouds, their light filtering down to touch a landscape that seemed somehow different than it had been that morning. The snow lay in new patterns, carved by winds that had blown from directions unknown. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of water moving, not the crash of ice breaking, but the gentle murmur of liquid flowing freely under an open sky. As the family settled into sleep around their fire, Ember cradled safe in her mother's arms, the painted animals on the cave walls seemed to regard them with ancient patience, as if they too were waiting for the changes that her birth had somehow set in motion. 3 moons had passed since Ember's birth, and with each day, the child seemed to grow more extraordinary rather than less. She rarely cried, even when hunger or cold might justify tears, and her eyes, which should have remained the cloudy blue-grey of all newborns, had cleared to a warm amber that seemed to hold firelight even in darkness. More unsettling still was the way she watched everything, her gaze following movements with an alertness that belonged to older minds, as if she were cataloguing and learning from each moment with an intensity that spoke of purposes beyond infant needs. But it was not only Ember who had changed in those weeks since the storm. The world itself seemed different, charged with an energy that made the very air feel alive. The aurora, which had always been visible but distant, now danced closer to the earth, its green and blue curtains rippling with such brightness that they could read by its light alone. Animals behaved strangely. The great white bears that usually avoided their territory now circled at a distance, not threatening but watching, as if they too sensed something awakening that demanded their attention. Most disturbing of all was the lake. For as long as anyone could remember, the Great Lake had been frozen solid, not just surface ice that might crack and shift with the seasons, but ice so deep and ancient that it had become part of the landscape itself, as permanent as the mountains that ringed its shores. Children played on its surface. Hunters crossed it to reach the distant valleys, and in the deepest winter, its ice was so thick that no sound could penetrate from the waters that lay entombed far below. But now, in the quiet hours when the wind dropped to nothing and the world held its breath, they could hear it. Thane had noticed it first, a sound so low and distant that he had thought it was his imagination, perhaps the echo of his own heartbeat amplified by the cave's stone walls. But as the nights passed, the sound grew stronger, more distinct, until there could be no doubt that something moved beneath the ice. Not the random shifting of water finding new courses, but movement with pattern and purpose, as if some vast creature had awakened from sleep longer than empires, and now stirred in the dark waters beneath their feet. "It is the ice heart dreaming," old Herrick said, when they spoke of it around the fire, his voice carrying the weight of stories older than memory. In the time before the Great Cold, when the world was green and the sun shone warm, there were spirits that lived in the deep waters. When the ice came, they did not die but slept, waiting for the world to remember warmth. Naya rocked Ember as she listened, her weathered face troubled. In her dreams, she had begun to see images that made no sense, vast shapes moving through waters clear as crystal, eyes like moons opening in the depths, songs that had no words but spoke directly to the soul. The child in her arms seemed to respond to these visions, growing still and alert whenever Naya spoke of her dreams, as if she understood far more than any infant should. The child's birth woke something, the old woman said finally, her words carrying the authority of one who had spent a lifetime reading the hidden currents of the world. Fire calls to fire. Warmth seeks warmth. What sleeps beneath the ice feels her presence and begins to remember what it means to be alive. As if summoned by their words, the sound came again, deeper now, resonating through the stone beneath their feet with such power that the cave itself seemed to vibrate like a struck bell. Ember turned her head toward the sound, her amber eyes wide and bright, and made a small noise that was neither distress nor pleasure, but something else entirely, as if she were answering a call meant only for her. Thane stood abruptly, his hunter's instincts finally overcoming the paralysis that had gripped him since the sounds began. "I must see," he said, moving toward the cave entrance with the determined stride of one who had decided that knowledge, however frightening, was preferable to uncertainty. The others followed, even Aya with Ember bundled against her chest, drawn by the same need to witness whatever was stirring in their world. They emerged from the cave into a night unlike any they had ever seen. The aurora blazed overhead with such intensity that the snow around them glowed green and blue, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with energy that made their skin tingle and their hair stand on end. The lake stretched before them, its surface appearing solid and unchanged in the strange light. But as they watched, the ice began to glow from within, as if massive shapes moved in the depths below, carrying their own illumination. The light grew stronger, spreading outward from the lake's center in ripples that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heartbeat. And with each pulse, the sound they had been hearing grew clearer, more distinct. It was singing, not human song, but something far older and more profound, a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, wordless but full of meaning that bypassed language and spoke directly to the places in the heart where memory lived. The melody was both mournful and hopeful, carrying within it the weight of countless seasons but also the promise of seasons yet to come. It spoke of ice that remembered being water, of winter that dreamed of spring, of sleep that prepared for waking. As the family stood transfixed by this impossible music, Ember began to respond. Her small voice rose in harmony with the vast song beneath the ice, creating sounds that no human infant should be able to make pure. Clear notes that seemed to bridge the gap between the world above and the ancient presence below. Her voice carried across the frozen lake and echoed back transformed, as if the very ice were learning to sing in response. The light beneath the surface grew brighter still, and suddenly they could see it, a shape vast, beyond comprehension, moving with fluid grace through waters that should have been solid. It was neither animal nor spirit, but something between, something that belonged to a time when such distinctions mattered less than they did now. Its eyes opened, like twin suns, and for a moment that lasted eternity, it looked directly at them, not with malice or hunger, but with recognition, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for this family, for this child whose birth had finally called it back to wakefulness. The creature, for lack of a better word, began to rise, and the ice above it groaned and cracked, under pressures that should have been impossible. Spiderwebs of fractures spread across the lake's surface, glowing with the same inner light, and steam began to rise where the cracks appeared, as if the water below was warmer than it had been in thousands of years. But even as fear should have driven them back to their shelter, none of them moved. The song that rose from the depths was too beautiful, too full of promise to inspire terror. Instead, they felt themselves called to witness, chosen to see the first stirring of changes that would reshape their world in ways they could not yet imagine. Ember's voice rose higher, her infant song somehow guiding the vast presence below, teaching it melodies it had forgotten during its long sleep. And in response, the creature began to dance, moving through the water with such grace that the ice above rippled like silk rather than cracking like stone. Its movement created currents that had not flowed for millennia, and where those currents touched the lake's borders, the eternal ice began impossibly to soften. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with colors that seemed pale and cold after the aurora's brilliance, the creature slowly descended back into the depths. Its song faded to a whisper, then to silence, but the cracks in the ice remained, glowing faintly in the growing light. Steam continued to rise from these fractures, carrying with it scents they had never experienced: green growing things, rich earth, the ozone smell of rain on stone. They returned to their cave in contemplative silence, each carrying within them the memory of something that would change everything. As Naya settled Ember beside the fire, The child opened her amber eyes and smiled the first true smile of her young life, as if she understood perfectly what had been accomplished in the night. "The world is waking up," she whispered to the baby, words meant for no ears but her own. "And you, little flame, are the one who called it back to life." Outside, the lake continued its slow transformation, and deep in the warming waters below, ancient dreams began their journey toward the light. The morning after the creature's song brought changes that could be felt in the very bones of the world. Thane woke to a sound he had never heard before, the gentle, persistent music of water flowing freely across ice. Not the violent crack and roar of ice breaking under pressure, but something softer, more patient, as if the frozen world were teaching itself to remember liquid motion, one drop at a time. He rose carefully, his movements muffled by long practice, and made his way to the cave entrance. When he lifted the hide covering, the sight that greeted him stopped his breath entirely. The endless expanse of white that had defined their world was unchanged in its vastness, but now it was marked by thin lines of darkness, streams of meltwater tracing delicate patterns across the snow, creating a lacework of tiny rivers that caught the grey morning light and threw it back in silver threads. The air itself felt different, not warm, for the cold still bit deep, and made breath visible in pale clouds, but somehow less rigid, as if the very molecules had loosened their grip on winter's iron discipline. When he breathed deeply, he could taste something beneath the familiar crystalline sharpness of frozen air, a hint of earth, of growing things sleeping beneath snow, possibilities that had been buried so long they had become legend. Aya joined him at the entrance, Ember cradled against her chest. The baby was awake and alert, her amber eyes tracking the movement of water with an intensity that seemed beyond her few months of life. As they watched, she extended one small hand toward the streams, her fingers opening and closing, as if trying to capture the sound of flowing water, to hold its music in her palm. "Listen," Aya whispered, her voice filled with the same wonder that had marked her since Ember's birth. "Do you hear it? The ice is singing." And it was. From every direction came the soft symphony of transformation, the plink and patter of drops falling from stone ledges, the gentle gurgle of water finding its way through channels carved by ancient currents, the deeper note of streams converging into flows strong enough to carry away winter's debris. It was music composed by physics and time, but it sounded like prayer, like the earth itself learning to rejoice. The rest of the family emerged from their sleep to witness this impossible dawn. Kale ran to the nearest stream, his young face bright with curiosity as he knelt beside the flowing water. He had never seen such a thing, liquid moving freely across the ground, warmer than the air around it, carrying within its current tiny fragments of a world he could barely imagine. When he cupped the water in his palms, it felt like holding mystery itself. Vera approached more cautiously, her small hands reaching toward the stream, but stopping just short of touching. She had been born into a world of ice and snow, where water existed only as frozen crystals, or the precious liquid they melted carefully by their fire. This moving, living water seemed almost magical to her, a substance that flowed like wind but could be touched, that sang like the aurora but left the taste of earth on the tongue. Old Harek moved among them with the slow dignity of one who had lived long enough to see the impossible made manifest. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside one of the larger streams, and when he finally allowed his fingers to touch the flowing water, tears began to run down his cheeks. Tears he made no effort to hide or explain. "I have lived to see the first thaw," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent believing such a thing would never come. "In all my seasons, through all the stories my grandfather told me of the time before the Great Cold, I never dared hope that the world might remember how to be warm again." Naya held Ember close to the largest of the streams, and the baby's response was immediate and extraordinary. She began to vocalize, not crying but making sounds that seemed to echo the water's music, her tiny voice creating harmonies that transformed the simple splash and gurgle into something approaching song. As she sang, the water seemed to flow more clearly, its sound growing sweeter, and where the stream passed closest to where she sat, the snow began to melt faster, creating wider channels that reflected more light, more life. The implications of what they were witnessing slowly became clear as the morning progressed. This was not a temporary phenomenon, not simply the result of an unusually warm day in an endless winter. The streams continued to flow even as the air temperature remained well below freezing, fed by sources deep beneath the ice, where the creature's movement had awakened waters that had slept since the world was young. The very foundations of their reality were shifting, and they were witnessing the first tentative steps of a transformation that would reshape everything they had ever known. As the sun climbed higher in the grey sky, and was it imagination, or did its pale light seem slightly warmer than it had the day before, they began to discover other changes. Plants that had been hidden beneath snow for generations were beginning to emerge, their hardy green shoots pushing through the white, with a determination that spoke of life too stubborn to surrender to any amount of cold. The tiny Arctic flowers that bloomed so rarely in their world appeared in greater numbers, their white and yellow petals bright against the snow like stars fallen to earth. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. Birds that usually flew in silent, efficient lines now called to each other in complex songs, as if they had suddenly remembered melodies that had been forbidden by winter's harsh law. Small creatures, lemmings and Arctic foxes moved more boldly across the open spaces, their usual caution tempered by what appeared to be curiosity about the transformed world around them. But perhaps the most profound change was in the family themselves. For the first time in generations, they began to speak of the future not as an endless repetition of survival against unchanging cold, but as something that might hold genuine possibilities. As they gathered around their fire that evening, their conversation turned to dreams they had never dared voice of warmer shelters, of hunts that yielded abundance rather than mere subsistence, of children who might grow up in a world where survival was not the only goal worth pursuing. Thane found himself remembering stories his own grandfather had told him, tales of vast herds that migrated across open grasslands, of rivers so full of fish that feeding a family required only patience rather than desperate skill, of seasons that brought their own gifts instead of new forms of hardship. For the first time, these stories felt like memories rather than fantasies, as if the water flowing outside their cave carried within it the promise of a world returning to life. As night fell and they prepared for sleep, Ember lay in her mother's arms and watched the fire with eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than her brief existence. The flames burned differently now, not with the desperate intensity of fuel, hoarded against endless cold, but with the steady confidence of warmth that knew it would be replenished. And in the depths of the fire, if one looked carefully, it was possible to see colors that had no names, the green of growing things, the blue of open water, the gold of sunlight on grassland. Outside, the streams continued their patient work, carving new channels through snow and ice, carrying away winter's accumulated weight, one drop at a time. The sound of flowing water had become the world's new heartbeat, steady and strong and full of promise. And somewhere in the depths of the awakening lake, vast eyes opened once more to watch the stars, while ancient currents stirred with the memory of seasons when the whole world danced to the rhythm of warmth and plenty. The first melt had begun, and with it, the long journey back to a world where ice was only winter's temporary guest rather than its eternal master. In her sleep, Ember smiled and sang softly to herself, her voice blending with the music of moving water, adding her own note to the symphony of change that would reshape the earth itself. The thaw had come at last, and nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation, that began with gentle streams, became a torrent that no human preparation could withstand. 7 suns had risen since the first melt, and each dawn brought waters more powerful than the last, until what had been whispered promises became thunderous declarations that the world would no longer remain frozen in time. The ancient lake, no longer content to sing softly from its depths, had begun to overflow its banks in cascades that caught the morning light and threw it back in rainbows that had not been seen since the stories of the first thaw lived only in memory. Thane stood at the cave entrance, watching the water rise with the particular stillness that comes to those who recognize the precise moment when survival requires surrender. Throughout the night, the sound of flowing water had grown from gentle music to a sustained roar that drowned out even the wind's ancient voice. Now, As pale sunlight filtered through clouds heavy with moisture rather than snow, he could see their world disappearing beneath waters that moved with purpose and power beyond human resistance. The stream that had delighted them with its modest flow now raged 20 paces wide, carrying with it debris from the awakening world, chunks of ice the size of boulders, uprooted shrubs that had somehow survived beneath the snow, and stranger things that spoke of changes happening beyond their sight. Trees floated past, their roots still trailing earth, as if whole forests were being freed from permafrost that had held them captive for millennia. In the distance, where the Great Lake met the horizon, columns of steam rose like the breath of sleeping giants, and the sound that emerged from that direction was both beautiful and terrifying, the voice of a world learning to live again. "We cannot stay," he said to the family gathered behind him, his words carrying the weight of decisions that allowed no alternative. The water was already seeping through cracks in the cave floor, pooling around the fire pit, where their flames hissed and struggled against the invasion of an element more ancient than combustion itself. Aya held Ember close, the child now 3 months old, and somehow more alert with each passing day. The baby's amber eyes tracked the movement of water with an intensity that seemed beyond her age, and when the sound of flowing streams reached her ears, she made soft sounds of recognition, as if she were greeting old friends returning from a long journey. Her small hands reached toward the cave entrance, fingers opening and closing in rhythm with the water's pulse. "The ancestors speak clearly," Naya said, her voice carrying the authority of dreams and visions. "The earth remembers its true shape, and we must learn to flow with it rather than stand against it." She had been preparing for this moment since the night the creature sang from beneath the ice, gathering their most essential belongings and wrapping them in hides that could survive immersion. Her movements now were efficient and calm, guided by an acceptance that came from understanding that resistance to such forces was not courage, but foolishness. They worked together with the coordinated grace of those who had faced crisis before, but this was unlike any challenge their experience had prepared them for. The rising water forced them to abandon not just their shelter, but the entire landscape that had defined their existence. As they packed their most precious possessions, tools, dried food, the fire-making stones that meant the difference between life and death, the water continued its patient advance, claiming territory that had been solid and dependable since before their grandparents walked the frozen earth. KL and Vera helped with the particular seriousness that children show when they sense that adult fears are no longer hidden behind protective calm. They gathered their few possessions, carved toys, the soft furs that served as both blankets and companions, and bound them into bundles that could be carried on their small backs. Their eyes were wide with excitement as much as fear, for this was the first great adventure of their young lives. The first time the world had revealed its capacity for change on a scale that demanded everything they had learned about adaptation and survival. As they prepared to leave the only home they had ever known, Harrick moved slowly through the cave, touching the painted walls one final time. His weathered fingers traced the outlines of animals that had been rendered by artists, whose names were lost to time, mammoth and horse, bison and bear, all of them waiting beneath the ice, for a world warm enough to sustain their return. The old man's eyes were bright, with tears he did not try to hide, but they were not tears of loss alone. Mixed with grief, for what they were leaving behind, was wonder at being chosen to witness transformation on a scale that stories could barely contain. The water reached their fire pit as they completed their preparations, hissing against heated stones and sending steam into air already thick with moisture. The flames guttered and died, but not before Naya could capture a small ember in a carved bone container, sealing it with clay and breath to preserve the promise of warmth for the journey ahead. As the last light from their fire disappeared beneath dark water, they turned toward the cave entrance and the world that waited beyond. What they found outside exceeded even their expanded expectations. The familiar landscape of snow and ice had been replaced by something that belonged to legends rather than lived experience. Streams had become rivers, and rivers had become torrents that carved new valleys through terrain that had seemed permanent as stone. Icebergs, massive chunks of frozen water, larger than their cave, drifted past like ghostly mountains, turning slowly in currents that carried them toward destinations. Only the water knew. The air itself felt different, heavy with moisture and alive with sounds they had no names for. Somewhere in the distance, ice cracked with reports like thunder, and beneath that came a deeper sound, the groan of glaciers, beginning their first movement in millennia. Ice sheets, the size of mountain ranges, learning to flow again towards seas that had been waiting for their return. They began their journey following the high ground that remained above the flood, their feet finding purchase on stones that wept with meltwater and earth that squelched with the unfamiliar softness of thawed ground. Behind them, their cave filled completely, becoming part of the great flow that carried away the last physical traces of the life they had known. But ahead lay possibility vast, as the waters themselves a world where survival might mean something more than the careful conservation of resources against unchanging scarcity. As they walked through this transformed landscape, Ember sang softly in her mother's arms, her voice somehow harmonizing with the sound of flowing water, and where her song touched the air around them, the way seemed clearer, the footing more secure, as if the child who had been born to call the world back to warmth was now guiding them safely through the first stages of its awakening. The great river that had swallowed their past flowed on toward horizons, bright with promise and danger in equal measure, carrying them forward into a future that would demand everything they thought they knew about being human in a world learning to remember what it meant to be alive. For 3 days they followed the high ridges above the flood, their feet learning the uncertain rhythm of walking on ground that shifted between frozen hardness and yielding mud as the permafrost continued its slow surrender to warmth. The transformed world spread below them like a vast lake dotted with islands of higher ground, and across this watery expanse moved shapes that filled them with wonder and desperate hope. The great herds were stirring. The mammoth had been legend for most of their lives, creatures known more through the ancient paintings on cave walls than through actual sight. The few that remained in their territory had been solitary wanderers, aged bulls who moved like ghosts through the endless white, too old or too stubborn to seek easier feeding grounds. But now, as the world awakened from its frozen sleep, something in the earth's transformation had called to memories older than ice, and the herds were gathering as they had not done for generations beyond counting. Thane first spotted them on the morning of their 4th day of travel, dark shapes moving against the lighter background of snow-covered tundra in the distance. Through the haze of moisture that rose from warming earth, they seemed like mirages at first, too many, too coordinated, too reminiscent of the stories the elders told to be real. But as the family made their careful way along, a ridge that offered clear sight lines, the truth became undeniable. Hundreds of mammoth were converging from all directions, following routes that seemed carved into their ancestral memory, heading toward feeding grounds that had been buried beneath ice since the world was young. "They know where the grass will grow," Naya said, her voice filled with the particular reverence she reserved for moments when the natural world revealed its deepest secrets. "The herds remember what the ice made us. Forget where the earth is richest, where the waters flow sweetest, where life can flourish rather than merely survive." The sight of the gathering herd created a crisis that none of them had anticipated. Their careful stores of dried meat and preserved fat could sustain them for perhaps another 10 days, but no longer. The flooding had swept away their cached supplies. Their snares were useless in this transformed landscape, and the familiar hunting grounds that had provided sustenance for generations lay beneath waters that showed no sign of receding. Without the herds, they faced the slow certainty of starvation. With the herds came the possibility of abundance beyond anything they had known, but also dangers that could destroy them more quickly than hunger. The mammoth migration was not a peaceful procession, but a force of nature as powerful and unpredictable as the thaw itself. The great beasts moved with purpose that brooked no obstacles, trampling everything in their path, fighting among themselves for position in the herd, and leaving behind them a wake of destruction that spoke of power beyond human measurement. To follow meant accepting risks that could kill them all in moments. To remain meant the slow death of watching their food disappear, while opportunity passed beyond their reach. They made camp that evening on a hilltop that offered both shelter from the wind and clear views of the migrating herds. and as the pale sun settled toward the horizon, they held council around a small fire that Naya had kindled from the ember, saved from their flooded cave. The dancing flames seemed small and fragile in the vastness of the awakening world, but their warmth remained the center, around which all their decisions turned. My father followed such a migration. When he was young, Harrick said, his weathered hands cupped around a bowl of hot tea brewed from the last of their precious herbs. He spoke of abundance beyond imagining enough meat to feed a clan through the entire season, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools that would last generations. But he also spoke of the cost, of the hunters who were trampled, of the families who became lost in the chaos, of the children who, his voice trailed off as his eyes found Kale and Vera, sitting close to the fire with the particular stillness that children show when they understand that adult words carry weight beyond their immediate meaning. Thane studied the herds through the gathering twilight, his hunter's eye calculating distances, timing. The complex mathematics of opportunity weighed against risk. The mammoth were magnificent in their power, each adult standing tall as two men and weighing as much as a dozen, their tusks gleaming in the firelight like ivory mountains. But it was not their size that gave him pause, it was their numbers. There were simply too many of them, moving too fast, driven by impulses too ancient and powerful for human planning to accommodate safely. We have no choice, Aya said finally, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that comes to those who have learned to read the truth behind comfortable alternatives. Ember slept against her chest, but even in sleep, the child's breathing seemed to synchronize with some distant rhythm, as if she were already attuned to the pulse of the migrating herds. The waters have taken our old life, and we must make a new one. The herds offer the only path forward that does not end in slow death. As if, summoned by their words, the sound of the migration reached them across the intervening distance. Not the individual voices of mammoth calling to each other, but something deeper and more complex. It was the sound of Earth itself moving, of thousands of tons of living flesh reshaping the landscape with each step, of a river of life flowing across terrain that had known only the stillness of ice for longer than human memory could reach. Young Kale stood suddenly, his child's body trembling with excitement he could no longer contain. I dreamed of them, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Last night, I dreamed I was running with them, and the ground shook like thunder, and there was grass everywhere, green grass taller than my head, and flowers, and streams full of fish. His carved horse, worn smooth by countless hours of handling, seemed to catch the firelight and come alive in his small hands. The decision made itself in the silence that followed his words. Dreams, in their world, were not mere fantasies, but messages that demanded attention, especially dreams that came to children on nights when the world itself was choosing its new shape. If the herds were calling to Kale in sleep, then perhaps the path forward was not as impossible as fear suggested. They spent the remaining hours of darkness in preparation, checking their traveling gear, redistributing their meager supplies, and binding everything secure for the hard journey ahead. Naya prepared sacred tokens from materials gathered during their flight, from the floodstones touched by the new waters. Earth from places where snow had melted, for the first time in generations. A single feather from a bird that had sung with a voice none of them recognized. These she wrapped in hide, and hung around each family member's neck, amulets, to carry the blessing of the awakening world. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with colors that seemed somehow richer and more varied than they had been before, the mammoth herds began their morning movement. The sound of their passage carried clearly in the still air, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to make the earth itself pulse with new life. And mixed with that sound came something else, something that made Ember stir and open her amber eyes. It was singing not human song, but the voice of the migration itself, wordless melodies that spoke of ancient paths remembered, of feeding grounds reclaimed, of life triumphant over the long sleep of ice. As the family gathered their belongings and prepared to descend toward the herds, Ember added her own voice to that distant music, her infant song somehow weaving itself into harmonies older than civilization. They set out into the morning light, leaving behind the safety of the heights for the dangerous promise of the valleys below. Behind them, the flooded world continued its transformation, while ahead, the great herds moved toward horizons that promised either abundance beyond imagining or destruction, swift as falling stone. The choice was made, and there could be no turning back. On the 7th night of their journey with the herds, when exhaustion had carved lines of weariness into even the youngest faces, and the constant thunder of Mammoth Passage had become the heartbeat of their world, Naya entered the deepest sleep she had known since the first thaw began. It was not the gentle rest of those who sleep secure in familiar places, but the profound surrender of consciousness that comes to shamans when the spirits have urgent messages that cannot wait for convenient moments. The dream began not with images, but with heat, a warmth that seemed to rise from the earth itself, beginning as a gentle comfort against the perpetual cold they had always known, then growing in intensity until it became something beyond ordinary fire. She found herself standing on a hilltop she did not recognize, looking out over a landscape that was familiar, yet utterly transformed. Where ice and snow had always covered the ground, now there flowed rivers of flame that moved like water, but burned without consuming, their liquid fire casting light that made the very air shimmer with possibilities she had no words to describe. These were not the destructive fires that consumed wood and flesh, but something far more ancient and fundamental, the fire that lived at the heart of the earth itself, the flame that had slept beneath the ice for millennia, and now awakened to reclaim a world that had forgotten its true nature. The rivers of fire flowed in patterns that seemed almost like writing, spelling out messages in a language that bypassed thought and spoke directly to the deepest places of understanding. As she watched, the fire rivers began to sing, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made the music of the awakening lake seem like a whisper by comparison. The song they sang was the history of the world itself, the time before the ice, when the earth had been warm and green and bursting with life forms she could barely imagine. But woven through these melodies of past abundance were threads of prophecy, visions of what was yet to come as the great thaw continued its work of restoration. In the heart of the largest fire river, a figure began to take shape, not human, but not entirely other. It was formed of flame and shadow, of heat and light dancing together in patterns too complex for mortal eyes to follow completely. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of creation itself, the first words spoken into the void, when the world began its long dance toward consciousness. "The child you carry with you is the bridge," the figure said, its words arriving not through her ears, but directly into her understanding, bypassing the limitations of language entirely. Born in storm, blessed by flame, called to song by the sleepers beneath the ice. Through her, the old world ends, and the new world begins. But bridges must bear weight from both sides, and the crossing will test everything she is and might become. The vision shifted, and Naya found herself looking into a future that spread before them, like a vast tapestry being woven by invisible hands. She saw the mammoth herds growing larger and larger as the ice retreated, becoming great migrations that reshaped the very continent with their passage. She saw forests appearing where glaciers had stood, their trees growing with impossible speed, as if making up for lost time. She saw her own people, not just their small family, but thousands of humans emerging from hidden refuges, as the warming world offered new possibilities for life beyond mere survival. But the visions were not uniformly bright. She saw storms of unprecedented violence, glaciers collapsing with force that shook mountains, floods that swallowed entire valleys in moments. She saw conflicts as different groups of humans encountered each other for the first time in generations, competing for resources in a world where the old rules no longer applied. And through it all, she saw Ember no longer an infant, but growing into something between human and elemental force, her presence somehow necessary for navigating the chaos of transformation. Fire transforms everything it touches, the flame figure continued, its form shifting and dancing like aurora made manifest. Wood becomes ash, ice becomes steam, earth becomes glass. But transformation is not destruction, it is the revelation of what was always possible but never allowed to emerge. The child will be the flame that shows your people their true form, their potential beyond survival, their place in a world that remembers how to flourish. The scene changed again, and now Naya stood beside a vast lake that was not frozen but liquid and clear, its surface reflecting skies. She had never seen skies touched with the green of growing things, the blue of summer warmth, the gold of harvest abundance. On the shore of this lake sat a woman who was unmistakably Ember grown to adulthood, but transformed in ways that went beyond simple aging. Her hair flowed like fire, her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire seasons, and when she spoke, her words created ripples on the water that spread out in perfect circles, each ring carrying messages to shores beyond the horizon. Around this adult, Ember gathered people of all ages, but they too were transformed not just by time, but by proximity to something that had taught them new ways of being human. They moved with confidence that spoke of abundance rather than scarcity, their faces bright, with knowledge that extended beyond the careful calculation of survival. Children played games that would have been impossible in the world of eternal winter, while adults pursued crafts and art that required surplus time and resources their ancestors could never have imagined. But the path from here to there leads through the great unmaking. The flame, figure warned, its voice, taking on tones of sorrow that even fire could carry. Before the new world can fully emerge, the old world must complete its dissolution. Ice will fall like mountains. Waters will rise like tsunamis. The earth itself will shake off the weight of winter, with violence that will test every living thing. Many will not survive the transition. Some who do survive will wish they had not. The visions began to move faster now, showing Naya glimpses of the trials that lay ahead. She saw their family separated by circumstances beyond their control, scattered across landscapes that changed daily as the thaw accelerated. She saw grief that would test the strongest hearts, choices that would demand sacrifices no parent should have to make. But threaded through all the darkness were golden threads of possibility, moments when Ember's growing power would make the impossible seem effortless, when the child's presence would turn disaster into opportunity. Tell them, the flame, figure said, as the Castellanti dream began to fade, its form dissolving back into the fire rivers that continued their eternal flow across the transformed landscape. Tell them that the ending is also a beginning, that what seems like loss is often revelation, that the child they protect carries within herself the seed of everything they will become. Naya woke, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and Ember's hand somehow touching her face, the infant's fingers warm as small coals against her skin. The camp around her was quiet, except for the distant rumble of the mammoth herds, but as consciousness returned fully, she realized that the warmth she felt was not just from the child's touch. The very ground beneath them seemed to pulse with heat that rose from somewhere far below, as if the earth itself were coming to life after its long sleep. As dawn approached and the others began to stir, she looked at Ember with new understanding. The child's amber eyes seemed to hold depths that reflected the fire rivers from her dream, and when the baby smiled, it was with recognition, as if she too had witnessed the visions and approved of what was to come. The awakening world stretched around them, full of promise and peril in equal measure. But now Naya knew why they had been chosen to make this journey, why this particular family had been called to witness and survive the great transformation. They carried within their small group not just their own survival, but the seed of humanity's future in a world learning to remember warmth. The firekeeper's dream was ending, but the fire itself, the fire that would reshape everything, was only beginning to burn. The herds had been moving for 12 days when hunger became a force stronger than fear, stronger than caution, stronger than the careful wisdom that had kept their family alive through countless seasons of scarcity. Their meager stores had dwindled to nothing, and the small game that might have sustained them had fled before the mammoth migration, leaving behind only the vast abundance that moved just beyond their reach, thousands of tons of meat that could feed them for years, if they could claim even the smallest portion of it. The decision to attempt the hunt came not through counsel or debate, but through the kind of desperate clarity that emerges when all alternatives have been exhausted. They had followed the herds faithfully, keeping pace with their movement while maintaining the careful distance that meant survival. But now that distance had become a barrier between their family and the life they needed to sustain, and barriers, no matter how necessary for safety, sometimes had to be crossed. Thane spent the pre-dawn darkness studying the herd with the intensity of one whose plans must account for forces beyond human control. The mammoth moved in patterns that seemed chaotic to untrained eyes, but revealed themselves to experienced hunters as something more complex social structures that determined which animals walked where, hierarchies that influenced how the herd responded to threats, rhythms of movement that could be predicted if one understood the ancient logic that governed their behavior. He had identified his target 3 days earlier, a young bull that traveled at the periphery of the main herd, large enough to provide abundant meat, but not so essential to the group's social structure that its loss would provoke widespread, aggressive response. The animal had a distinctive scar across its left flank, a white line against dark hair that made it easier to track among the constantly shifting mass of bodies. More importantly, it had shown a tendency to lag slightly behind the others when the herd crossed difficult terrain, creating brief moments when it might be separated enough for a coordinated attack to have some chance of success. As the pale sun rose through clouds heavy with moisture, Thane gathered his family around their small fire for what they all understood might be their final meal together. The gravity of what they were attempting required no explanation. They had all seen hunters trampled by creatures far smaller than mammoth, had all heard the stories of hunts that ended in disaster despite the most careful planning. But they had also seen their food stores disappear and felt the particular weakness that comes when the body begins to consume itself for the energy needed to survive. "We hunt as one," Thane said, his voice carrying the authority of decisions that allowed no doubt. No individual heroics, no attempts to claim glory. We move together, strike together, and retreat together. The moment any one of us is in real danger, we abandon the hunt and accept whatever consequences hunger brings. Cale listened with the bright-eyed attention of one old enough to understand the seriousness of adult concerns, but still young enough to feel excitement, alongside fear. He would not participate directly in the hunt. His role was to remain to the elders and help protect Ember. But he understood that success or failure would determine whether his family continued to exist. His carved horse seemed to pulse with warmth in his small hands, as if the spirit of the ancient migrations lived within the worn bone and responded to the approach of real herds. Aya checked her own weapons, with movements grown automatic through years of practice. But her attention remained divided between preparation and the child at her breast. Ember had been unusually restless through the night, her amber eyes bright and alert even when sleep should have claimed her. Now, as the moment of action approached, the infant seemed to sense the tension that filled the air like an approaching storm, and her small sounds took on the quality of song-wordless melodies that somehow harmonized with the distant rumble of mammoth voices. "The child sings for the hunt," Naya observed, her weathered hands steady as she prepared the tools of her own participation. Not weapons, but the sacred implements that would help ensure their spirits remained protected during the violence to come. "The ancestors approve of what we do today. They know we hunt not for sport or pride, but for the continuation of life itself." They made their way carefully through terrain, transformed by the constant passage of massive feet, moving with the practiced silence of those who had learned to read the landscape's moods. The ground beneath them was churned mud mixed with snow, treacherous footing that could turn an ankle or send an unwary hunter sliding into disaster. But it also provided concealment, hollows, and ridges carved by the herd's passage that offered hiding places from which an attack might be launched. The hunt began with patience hours of careful stalking as they positioned themselves along the route the herd would take through a narrow valley between two hills. The scarred bull was exactly where Thane had predicted it would be, lagging, perhaps 50 paces, behind the main body of mammoth as it picked its way through terrain made difficult by meltwater streams that cut unexpected channels through the previously solid ground. When the moment came, it unfolded with the terrible beauty that marks all encounters between human skill and natural force. Thane's spear flew true, its obsidian point finding the gap between the animal's ribs, with precision that spoke of countless hours of practice refined by desperate necessity. Aya's throwing stick followed an instant later, adding its weight to the attack. For one perfect moment, it seemed as though their planning and courage might be rewarded with success. But mammoth, even young ones, do not die easily, and the wounded bull's response was immediate and devastating. Its trumpet of pain and rage carried across the valley, alerting the entire herd to danger. What had been an orderly migration suddenly became chaos, as hundreds of animals began to mill about, seeking the source of threat, their massive bodies turning the already difficult terrain into a death trap of moving flesh and bone. Thane tried to retreat as he had planned, but the ground that had seemed solid beneath his feet gave way, softened by meltwater in ways his experience could not have anticipated. He fell heavily, his leg twisting with a sound that carried clearly even above the mammoth's bellowing. As he struggled to rise, the wounded bull turned toward him, its small eyes bright with pain and fury, its tusks catching the pale sunlight as they swept down toward the hunter who had dared to challenge it. What happened next would live in family memory long after the immediate pain had faded to a bearable ache. Ember, secure in her mother's arms at what should have been a safe distance, suddenly began to sing, with a voice no infant should have possessed, pure, clear notes that cut through the chaos like sunlight through storm clouds. Her song somehow reached the wounded mammoth, and for a moment that lasted eternity, the great beast paused, its tusks mere inches from Thane's helpless form. In that pause, Aya acted with desperate courage, placing herself between her husband and the mammoth while somehow keeping Ember safe. Her second spear, thrown from impossibly close range, found its mark in the animal's eye, and the bull staggered backward, its attention momentarily diverted by fresh pain. Naya and Harik moved as one, dragging Thane away from the immediate danger, while Aya continued to face the wounded mammoth with nothing but her hunting knife and the fierce protection that comes to those defending what they cannot bear to lose. The bull took 3 steps toward her before its wounds finally claimed it, the massive body crashing to earth with force that sent tremors through the ground. For a moment, silence returned to the valley, broken only by the sound of the main herd moving away and the labored breathing of humans who had pushed themselves beyond the limits of what should have been possible. But victory's price became clear as they gathered around Thane's still form. The fall had shattered his leg beyond their ability to heal properly, and the internal injuries spoke of damage that even their limited medical knowledge could recognize as potentially fatal. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his skin pale with the particular pallor that comes when life begins its retreat from flesh. As the day faded toward evening and they made camp beside their kill, the family faced a reality that no amount of meat could soften. The man who had guided them through the early stages of the Great Thaw, who had made the decisions that kept them alive when their world dissolved around them, now lay helpless beside the fire that Naya had kindled with hands that shook for the first time in decades. Ember sang softly through the night, her voice somehow keeping time with Thane's labored breathing, as if she were trying to tie his spirit to the world through melodies too ancient for words. And in her singing, those who listened carefully could hear something beyond mere infant sound, the voice of the awakening world itself, calling to all life, to continue, to endure, to transform, rather than surrender to the darkness that waited at the edges of every flame. The rain began on the morning they knew Thane would not see another sunset, falling from clouds so heavy and dark they seemed to press against the earth itself. This was not the gentle precipitation that had marked the early days of the thaw, but something vast and relentless, water falling in sheets so thick the air became difficult to breathe, transforming the already saturated ground into a landscape that seemed more liquid than solid, where the boundaries between earth and sky began to dissolve. Thane lay beside their struggling fire, his breath coming in shallow gasps that matched the rhythm of Ember's lullabies, his weathered face peaceful with the particular serenity that comes to those who have completed their part in the world's great work. He had lived to see the ice begin its retreat, had guided his family through the first stages of transformation, had provided them with meat enough to survive the trials ahead. Now, as the rain drummed against their inadequate shelter, he prepared for a different kind of journey. "The world cries for the ending," Naya said, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. But her words carried the authority of one who had learned to read the deeper meanings hidden within natural events. Every beginning requires grief for what came before. The earth weeps for the age of ice as it prepares to birth the age of warmth. Through the 3 days of Thane's final decline, the rain continued without pause, gradually escalating from heavy precipitation to something approaching deluge. Streams that had been gentle ribbons of meltwater became torrents that carved new valleys through terrain still soft from its release from permafrost. In the distance, sounds unlike anything they had ever heard echoed across the transformed landscape. The crash of glaciers, collapsing under their own weight. The rumble of landslides, as mountains shed their burden of ice. The roar of waterfalls, where none had existed since the world was young. On the 4th morning, as Thane drew his last breath with Ember's hand, somehow touching his face, the rain intensified beyond all previous measure. What had been a storm became something that belonged to legend, rather than lived experience, a precipitation so constant and overwhelming that it seemed less like weather than like the sky itself, dissolving and pouring its substance onto the earth below. The air grew thick with moisture, making each breath an effort, while lightning blazed continuously overhead in patterns that spoke of atmospheric forces pushed beyond their normal boundaries. The funeral they gave him was necessarily simple, a cairn of stones gathered from the hillside, arranged in the ancient patterns that would guide his spirit toward whatever realm waited beyond the storm. But as they placed the final stone, something extraordinary happened. The rain, which had been falling straight down with mechanical persistence, began to spiral around the gravesite, creating a column of wind and water that rose toward the storm-heavy clouds above. For just a moment, the curtain of precipitation parted, allowing a shaft of pale sunlight to touch the stones they had arranged with such care. "He goes to prepare the way," Naya said, her tears indistinguishable from the rain that streamed down her weathered cheeks. "Where he walks now, the ice retreats faster, the grass grows greener, the rivers run clearer. He carries our love into the warming world that waits." With Thane's passing, leadership of their small group fell naturally to Aya, but the responsibilities came at a time when the very concept of group survival was being tested by forces beyond human influence. The rain continued to intensify, transforming the landscape so rapidly that routes passable in the morning became impassable by evening. Valleys filled with water overnight, while hillsides that had seemed solid began to slide as the permafrost beneath them thawed and lost its structural integrity. 5 days after the funeral, they encountered the first refugees. These were people like themselves, families that had been driven from ancestral territories by the accelerating thaw, carrying what few possessions they could manage, while seeking higher ground that might offer temporary safety. But as the refugees shared their stories around the small fires that managed to survive the constant rain, it became clear that the transformation was happening everywhere, at a pace that outstripped any human ability to adapt. Whole communities had been swept away by floodwaters that rose faster than evacuation was possible. Ancient caves that had sheltered humans for generations had filled with water overnight, their occupants forced to flee into storms that killed as surely as drowning. Mammoth herds that had provided abundance for those brave enough to hunt them were now scattered and unreachable, driven by the chaos to seek refuges that human followers could not match. The refugees brought other news as well, stories of conflicts as desperate groups competed for resources that grew scarcer even as the warming world promised future abundance. Families that had never encountered strangers were suddenly forced to negotiate with others, whose customs and languages were shaped by completely different survival strategies. Some of these encounters had ended in cooperation and mutual aid, but others had devolved into violence, as fear and desperation overcame the hospitality that had once been essential for survival in the ice world. As these stories circulated around their rain-soaked fires, a painful recognition began to emerge. Their small family group, which had functioned so effectively in the stable world of eternal winter, was too small and too vulnerable to survive the chaos of transformation alone. They needed the protection and resources that only a larger community could provide. But joining such a community would mean abandoning the intimate bonds that had sustained them through the early stages of their journey. The decision, when it came, was made by the children rather than the adults. Kale, now 8 years old, and already showing signs of the hunter he might become if he lived long enough, announced one morning that he had dreamed of traveling north with a group of strangers who carried fire-starting stones unlike any they had ever seen. Vera, barely 6 but possessed of the particular clarity that sometimes comes to those who have never known a stable world, described dreams of going south, with families who sang in harmonies their own traditions had never explored. The child calls to many paths, Naya observed, watching Ember respond to these conflicting visions with alert interest rather than distress. She will need teachers we cannot provide, protection we cannot offer, wisdom that can only come from walking in many different ways. Perhaps our family must grow larger to serve her properly, even if that means growing apart. The separation, when it finally came, was both inevitable and heartbreaking. Standing in rain so heavy it was like being underwater, they divided their meager possessions and prepared to follow different groups of refugees toward different hopes of survival. Kale went north with a family that had promised to teach him new hunting techniques adapted to the changing world. Vera traveled south with elders who carried songs that spoke of plant foods and healing herbs their own traditions had never encountered. Aya, Naya, and Ember continued east, following watercourses that led toward rumors of communities that had learned to thrive rather than merely survive in the transforming world. As they walked away from the children who had been the center of their world for so long, Ember began to sing not the lullabies they had known, but something new, a melody that seemed to weave together all the voices they had heard from refugees, all the dreams that had guided their choices, all the possibilities that stretched ahead through the endless rain. Behind them, the storm continued its work of dissolution and renewal, tearing down the last remnants of the ice world, while preparing the foundation for whatever would emerge from the chaos. And in the singing of the child who had been born to call the world back to warmth, all the scattered members of their family carried with them the promise that even separation was a kind of connection, that even endings were preparation for beginnings, too vast and wonderful for their current understanding to contain. The storm of years raged on, washing away the last of the old world, while the new world struggled to be born from the wreck's ruins. And somewhere in that struggle, carried forward by love, stronger than distance, and hope deeper than despair, the future continued its slow emergence from the dreams of a child whose voice had learned to sing the very foundations of transformation itself. 7 seasons had passed since the great storm scattered their family across the awakening world, and the child who had once been carried in her mother's arms now walked on legs, grown strong from endless journeying through landscapes that changed with each dawn. Ember had become something between daughter and guide, her amber eyes holding depths that seemed to read the very mood of the transforming earth, her voice weaving melodies that helped her small band of survivors navigate a world where the old landmarks had vanished beneath waters that flowed towards seas they had never imagined. The group that followed her footsteps now bore little resemblance to the desperate refugees who had fled the collapsing ice. They had learned to read the language of the new world, the green shoots that spoke of safe ground, the bird songs that announced fresh water, the quality of morning light that promised fair weather for travel. Most remarkably, they had learned to trust abundance after generations of hoarding against scarcity, to accept that in this transformed world, tomorrow might actually offer more than today rather than less. The valley they entered on this particular morning exemplified everything their ancestors would have considered impossible. Where ice should have reigned eternal, meadows rolled away toward horizons, painted with wildflowers, in colors that had no names in their ancient vocabulary. The air itself tasted of growing things, rich earth breathing after its long sleep. Pollen carried on breezes, warm enough to touch exposed skin without pain, the green scent of photosynthesis, as countless plants transformed sunlight into the very substance of life. Aya walked beside her daughter, with the measured pace of one who had learned to find joy in simple movement across ground that yielded gently beneath their feet, rather than threatening to steal warmth through inadequate souls. The woman who had once focused all her energy on conservation and careful rationing now gathered handfuls of berries without counting, knowing that the bushes they passed held more fruit than their small group could consume, that tomorrow would bring new sources of nourishment rather than the gradual exhaustion of hoarded stores. "The world remembers how to be generous," she said to Naya, who walked with them despite the accumulation of seasons that should have made such journeys impossible for one of her advanced years. But the warming world seemed to have given the old woman new vitality, as if the return of abundance had awakened energies that had been dormant during the long years of mere survival. The animals they encountered had changed as dramatically as the landscape itself, where the ice world had supported only the hardiest species creatures, adapted for extreme cold and limited resources. This awakening Earth teemed with life forms that spoke of ecological complexity beyond their previous experience. Birds filled the air with songs so intricate they seemed like conversations, while in the streams that crossed their path, fish moved in silver abundance that would have fed entire clans during the harsh seasons. Most wonderfully, these creatures showed little fear of human presence. The long isolation imposed by the Ice Age had created a world where humans and animals had existed in separate spheres, meeting only in the desperate contests of hunter and prey. But now, as they walked through meadows where deer grazed peacefully and foxes played in the morning sunlight, it seemed possible to imagine a different relationship, one based on coexistence rather than competition, abundance shared rather than scarcity fought over. Ember moved through this abundance with the particular grace of one who had never known a world where such plenty was impossible. To her, flowers that bloomed in impossible profusion were simply how flowers behaved. Streams that ran clear and sweet were the natural state of water, and animals that showed curiosity, rather than fear, were evidence of the world's fundamental friendliness. Her songs, which had once carried the weight of survival and desperation, now lifted into melodies that celebrated the simple pleasure of being alive in a world that welcomed life. But it was not just the abundance that marked this new world as different from the one their ancestors had known. The very quality of existence had changed in ways that went beyond the material transformation from scarcity to plenty. The constant vigilance that had been necessary for survival in the ice world, the perpetual calculation of risk and resource, the careful hoarding of every calorie and every moment of warmth had given way to something their language had no words for. They moved through their days with attention freed to notice beauty rather than only danger, with time to contemplate rather than only to work for immediate survival. As the sun reached its zenith, casting shadows that were soft and blue rather than sharp and threatening, they paused beside a stream whose banks were lined with grasses so thick and green they seemed like a carpet woven from summer itself. The water ran over stones, polished smooth by the patient work of current and time, creating music that spoke of permanence rather than the desperate urgency that had characterized their previous existence. They ate their midday meal not from carefully rationed stores but from the abundance the morning's walk had provided, roots that pulled easily from soil rich with nutrients, fruits that hung heavy from branches almost overladen with their own productivity, honey found in hollowed trees that supported entire colonies of bees, in communities too complex and beautiful to have been possible during the harsh years. The food itself tasted different, richer, more complex, carrying flavors that spoke of soil that had been enriched by countless seasons of growth and decay, rather than locked in permafrost. As they rested, letting the warmth of the sun soak into bones that still carried the memory of endless cold, Ember began one of her songs, a melody that seemed to weave together all the sounds of the awakened world. In her voice, the stream's bubbling became rhythm, the wind through new leaves became harmony, and the distant calls of animals became counterpoint to a composition that told the story of transformation itself. Other survivors, drawn by the sound of her singing, emerged from the landscape, where they had been traveling their own paths through this abundance. They came singly and in small groups, families like their own, who had been scattered by the great changes, individuals who had lost their original communities but found new purpose in this world that demanded different skills than those required for mere survival. As these travelers gathered around Ember's song, something remarkable happened. Without discussion or formal decision, they began to harmonize, each adding their voice to melodies that seemed to arise spontaneously from the shared experience of having survived the transition from ice to abundance. The music they created together spoke of memories held in common, despite never having met before: the taste of ice-cold air, the particular exhaustion of walking through snow, the precious warmth of fires carefully tended through endless nights. But more than shared memories, their harmonies carried shared hopes. In the blending of voices that had learned different songs during the desperate years, new melodies emerged that spoke of possibilities their ancestors could never have imagined. They sang of settlements rather than temporary camps, of seasons that would be marked by growth rather than survival, of children who would inherit abundance rather than the careful knowledge of how to endure scarcity. As evening approached, and the gathering naturally prepared to disperse toward their various destinations, they did so with the understanding that they had participated in something significant. The random meeting beside a stream in a flower-filled valley had become a moment when the scattered survivors of the ice world recognized themselves as the creators of whatever world would emerge from the abundance that surrounded them. Ember's song continued as they traveled on, but now it was carried by multiple voices spread across the landscape, each group of wanderers adding their harmony to a composition that stretched beyond any single location. In their singing, the awakening world found its voice not the desperate cries of survival, but the joyful complexity of life, celebrating its own abundance. The wanderers moved on through a world that bloomed around them like a garden, their footsteps leaving trails that other travelers would follow, their songs marking pathways through abundance, too vast to be comprehended by any single journey, too rich to be exhausted by any number of gatherings. They were the first citizens of a world learning to remember what it meant to flourish rather than merely endure. The cave they discovered by accident would change everything they thought they knew about their place in the world's long story. It was Ember who found it, following a melody that seemed to call to her from stones that had seen more seasons than human memory could count, a song without voice that drew her away from their evening camp toward a hillside where shadows fell in patterns that spoke of hidden depth. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to pass through sideways, concealed behind curtains of new vegetation that had grown wild in the seasons since the ice retreated. But as Ember squeezed through the opening, her amber eyes adjusting to the darkness, within, the soft sound she made half gasp, half recognition brought the others hurrying to see what had stolen their guide's voice so completely. What they found within that ancient chamber was nothing their world had prepared them to understand. The cave stretched back into darkness that their small torches could not fully illuminate, its walls covered with images that spoke of human presence in this place during times so remote they belonged more to legend than memory. But these were not crude scratchings or simple records of hunts and seasons. These were artworks of staggering sophistication, painted by hands that understood color and form and composition with mastery, that spoke of cultures as complex as any their harsh world had ever supported. Animals danced across the stone surfaces in processions that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, horses running with manes that flowed like water, bison charging with such lifelike intensity that their painted eyes seemed to track the movement of human observers, great cats stalking through painted forests that had vanished beneath the ice before their grandparents had drawn breath. But it was not just the technical skill of the artwork that left them speechless. It was the recognition that these images depicted a world of abundance, similar to the one they were only now beginning to experience: a green world, a warm world, a world where humans and animals had coexisted in relationships based on reverence rather than desperation. Naya moved through the cave with the particular reverence she reserved for encounters with the sacred, her weathered hands hovering inches above paintings that seemed too precious to touch. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the weight of understanding that went beyond simple surprise. "We are not the first," she whispered, her words echoing in the stone chamber, with an authority that made them all listen more carefully. "The world has warmed before, has cooled before, has welcomed life and then hidden it beneath ice, only to welcome it again when the time was right. We walk in footsteps older than our oldest stories." As they explored deeper into the cave, their discoveries became even more profound. They found chambers where ancient artists had worked palettes, still stained with pigments made from minerals and plants they could recognize. Tools carved from stone and bone with such precision they seemed almost modern, and most remarkably, evidence of a sophisticated understanding of the seasonal cycles that had governed life in the warm world these painters had known. One wall showed what could only be a calendar of sorts, a complex arrangement of symbols that tracked not just the movements of sun and moon, but the migrations of animals, the blooming of plants, the optimal times for gathering different resources. It was a record of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with abundance, rather than struggling against scarcity, knowledge that had been preserved in stone when the ice came and the world forgot how to be warm. But perhaps the most moving discovery came in the deepest chamber, where the ancient artists had painted what could only be understood as a prophecy. The images here showed the ice advancing great white sheets covering the green world they had known, burying the forests and rivers and grasslands beneath frozen wasteland that stretched beyond all horizons. But the final painting in the sequence showed something else. A small figure, clearly human, standing beside melting ice, while holding what appeared to be fire in cupped hands. And around this figure, the ice retreated, revealing beneath it a world even more beautiful than the one that had been buried. They knew, Aya breathed, her voice filled with the particular awe that comes from recognizing destiny fulfilled. Somehow, they knew that the cold would end, that someone would come who could call the world back to warmth. They painted Ember's story before she was born, before the ice had even finished claiming the world they loved. As they stood in that deepest chamber, surrounded by images that bridged the vast gap between their world and one that had vanished into legend, Ember began to sing. But this time, her voice carried something new, harmonies that seemed to echo from the painted walls themselves, as if the ancient artists had somehow embedded their own songs in the pigments they used, waiting for the right voice to awaken them again. The song that filled the cave spoke of continuity across time spans that reduced individual lives to heartbeats, of human persistence, through transformations that seemed to demand more than any species could endure. But woven through these melodies of endurance were themes of hope and promise, the understanding that even the darkest ages were temporary, that ice eventually melted, that life found ways to preserve itself and its wisdom through even the longest nights. As they listened to Ember's song resonating in the chamber, where ancient hands had painted visions of futures their eyes would never see, each member of their small group felt the profound shift that comes from understanding one's place in a story larger than individual existence. They were not refugees, fleeing the collapse of the only world they had known. They were inheritors of a legacy that stretched back through cycles of cold and warmth, ice and abundance, despair and renewal, that had been playing out since humans first learned to see beyond the immediate demands of survival. The paintings revealed other secrets as well. Hidden among the more obvious images of animals and landscapes were symbols that spoke of a sophisticated understanding of the forces that drove the world's transformations, astronomical markers that tracked the long cycles that governed the advance and retreat of ice, seasonal indicators that showed how ancient peoples had synchronized their lives with rhythms too vast for short-term observation to detect, and most remarkably, what appeared to be a form of writing that preserved not just information, but wisdom about how to live in harmony with abundance, rather than in constant struggle against scarcity. When they finally emerged from the cave, they carried with them more than knowledge, they carried identity. The random survivors who had entered that hidden chamber had become something new, guardians of continuity, inheritors of responsibility to preserve and extend wisdom that had already survived one complete cycle of world-ending transformation. They understood now that their journey through the melting world was not just personal survival, but participation in the restoration of human knowledge that had been waiting beneath the ice for the right moment to re-emerge. As they made camp that evening in the valley below the cave, their conversation turned naturally to questions they had never thought to ask before. How many other caves held similar treasures? What other forms of ancient wisdom had survived the Ice Age, waiting to be rediscovered? How much of what they were learning to do in this abundant world was actually remembering rather than inventing? But perhaps most importantly, they began to understand that they carried obligations to the future as well as connections to the past. Somewhere, in ages to come, the ice might advance again, and when it did, humans would need to preserve not just their lives but their knowledge, their art, their understanding of how to live well in whatever world emerged when the cold retreated. That night, as Ember sang them towards sleep, her melodies carried new complexities, harmonies that seemed to bridge not just their small group, but all the voices that had ever sung human songs in times of transformation. In her voice, the ancient artist lived again, and through her song, they added their own harmony to a composition that would continue long after their individual voices had joined the silence from which all songs emerge and to which all songs return. They slept that night, with the profound peace that comes from understanding that one's struggles are part of a pattern larger and more meaningful than personal survival, that even the endings are preparation for beginnings, too vast and wonderful for any single generation to comprehend completely. 3 full years had passed since their discovery of the painted cave, and the world's transformation had accelerated beyond all their early expectations. Where the change had once been measured in streams and patches of green, now entire landscapes shifted from season to season, as if the earth were making up for lost time by embracing abundance with an enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on the overwhelming. But nowhere was this transformation more dramatic, more final, or more beautiful than in the place they had come to think of as the edge of forever, where the last great glacier made its slow surrender to the warming world. Ember stood now as a child of 7 summers, tall for her age, and marked by the particular poise that comes to those who have spent their entire remembered life as guides and interpreters between human needs and natural forces. Her amber eyes had deepened with experience that seemed beyond her years, and her voice had grown from the pure notes of infancy into something richer and more complex, an instrument capable of harmonies that seemed to translate directly between the language of human hearts and the deeper rhythms that govern the Kumsiri. Awakening world. The glacier rose before them, like a mountain range, carved from winter itself, its surface scarred and crevassed by the forces of its own dissolution. But where the ice fields they had known in the old world had been uniformly white and silent, this dying giant was alive with color and sound. Streams of meltwater had carved channels through the ice that glowed with inner, light blue as deep sky, green as spring forest, crystal clear as the dreams of perfect clarity. The sound of its melting was a constant symphony, the drip and splash of individual droplets, joining the rush and roar of streams that had grown into rivers during their long journey to reach this place. What made this glacier's retreat so different from the chaotic dissolution they had witnessed elsewhere was its sense of ceremony. Here, the ice did not collapse in violent avalanches or disappear in sudden floods. Instead, it withdrew with dignity, revealing the landscape beneath it layer by careful layer, like an ancient scroll being unrolled to reveal text written in languages of stone and soil that had been hidden for millennia. As they watched from the safe distance that such massive forces demanded, they could see the process of revelation happening in real time. Valley floors appeared where none had been visible that morning, their surfaces covered with debris from the ice's long occupation, but already showing signs of the plant life that would reclaim them. Rock formations emerged that spoke of geological forces from the world's youth, shaped into sculptures that no human hand could have conceived. Most remarkably, they began to see evidence of the world that had existed before the ice-fossilized trees, still standing where they had grown, when the climate was warm, their petrified trunks serving as monuments to abundance that predated human memory. "It is like watching the world be born," Aya said, her voice filled with the particular reverence that had marked all their encounters with the great changes. She carried in her travel pack artifacts they had gathered during their long journey. Seeds from plants that grew in the warmest valleys. Stones that held the colors of flowers they had seen blooming in abundance. Tools they had learned to craft for abundance rather than scarcity. These treasures spoke of their transformed relationship with the world, their evolution from refugees, fleeing disaster, to explorers, cataloging wonders. Naya, now approaching an age that should have made such journeys impossible, but somehow growing more vital as the world grew warmer, moved among the ice-carved stones, with the particular attention of one who understood that they were witnessing not just change, but completion. Her weathered hands touched surfaces that had been hidden beneath ice since before her ancestors had learned to make fire, and in that touch was both blessing and farewell acknowledgement that the world of endless winter that had shaped their entire cultural identity was finally, irrevocably ending. The ancestors painted truly, she said, referring to the images they had found in the cave that had changed their understanding of their place in the world's long story. They saw this day when the ice would retreat and the earth would remember warmth. They painted the ceremony of ending and beginning, and we are blessed to witness what they could only imagine. As if called by her words, Ember approached the glacier's edge with the fearlessness that marked all her interactions with the forces of transformation. The ice here was not the blue-white of winter cold, but something far more complex, a substance that seemed to contain within its crystalline structure all the seasons of its formation, all the storms that had fed it, all the years when it had been the boundary between possible and impossible. When she placed her small hand against the ice, the change was immediate and extraordinary. Where her palm touched the frozen surface, the melting accelerated not with violence or sudden destruction, but with a gentleness that spoke of ice finally given permission to become what it had always longed to be. Water ran between her fingers, warm as tears of joy, and where each drop touched the ground, something green immediately began to grow. But more than the physical transformation, her touch seemed to awaken something in the glacier, itself a voice that had been silent since the ice first began to form. The sound that emerged from the melting was like singing, wordless melodies that carried within them the memory of every storm that had fed the glacier, every season when it had grown stronger, every year when it had served as guardian of the frozen world. It was the ice's own song of completion, its acknowledgement that its time as ruler of the earth was ending, and its blessing on what would come after. Ember sang back to the glacier, her young voice somehow matching the ancient harmonies that arose from its dissolution. In her song was gratitude for all the ice had preserved during the long years, when preservation was the only form of hope available to the world. Her melodies acknowledged the beauty of winter, the strange peace that came with endless cold, the particular forms of life that had flourished in the world of scarcity and careful conservation that was now passing away. As her song continued, something even more remarkable began to happen. The other travelers who had joined their journey, refugees and wanderers, families and individuals who had been drawn together by the magnetic pull of Ember's presence began to add their voices to the farewell. Each carried in their own songs the memory of different aspects of the ice world, different forms of loss and survival, different hopes for what the warm world might offer their children. Together, their harmonies created something that transcended individual voice or personal memory. They sang the Ice Age itself to its conclusion, a conscious communal act of recognition and release that honored what had been while embracing what was becoming. In their music, the glacier found permission to complete its transformation, to give up its ancient role as guardian of winter, and become instead the source of rivers that would water the abundant world, now emerging from its retreat. As the sun set behind the dying glacier, painting its bark surface with colors that spoke of ending and beginning in equal measure, they witnessed what might have been the most beautiful sight any human eyes had ever seen. The entire face of the ice began to glow from within, illuminated by light that seemed to come from the heart of winter itself, saying goodbye to the world it had protected through the long ages, when protection meant burial beneath layers of cold that could preserve but never nurture. The light lasted until full darkness fell, and when it finally faded, they knew that they had been present at one of the great transitions in the world's long story. The age of ice was ending not with catastrophe or mourning, but with ceremony and blessing, with recognition and gratitude for all that had been preserved through the frozen years, and with hope for all that would flourish in the warm years ahead. That night, they slept with the sound of rapidly flowing water as their lullaby, knowing that they had said farewell to winter itself, and awakened to find themselves citizens of spring that would last for generations beyond their ability to count or imagine. In the season that followed their farewell to the last glacier, they discovered that the warm world offered possibilities their ancestors could never have dreamed, and slowly, carefully, with the reverence due to profound transformation, they began the delicate work of learning how to live in harmony with abundance, rather than in constant struggle against scarcity. It was Ember who first understood that their relationship with the earth itself could become something entirely new, not just taking what was needed for survival, but participating in the creation of plenty that would sustain not just their own small group, but communities they could barely envision. The valley they chose for their first permanent settlement spoke of possibilities that seemed almost too wonderful to be real. A river ran through its center, not the desperate trickle they had learned to value in the ice world, but a substantial flow that carried water clear as crystal and cold as snow, reliable through all seasons, and capable of supporting life far beyond their immediate needs. The soil along its banks was rich and dark, speaking of nutrients accumulated through countless seasons of growth and decay, earth that would respond to cultivation with abundance, that their carefully hoarded seeds could multiply beyond anything their careful conservation had prepared them to expect. But perhaps most remarkably, this valley came with teachers. They were not human teachers, but the land itself seemed eager to demonstrate how abundance functioned, when fear no longer governed the relationship between need and resource. Wild grains grew in patches that showed how cultivation might be possible on a larger scale. Fruit trees, freed from the competition of ice-adapted vegetation, spread their branches wide and heavy, with harvests that required no human effort beyond the gathering of what was freely offered. Root vegetables grew in soil so fertile they could be harvested without depleting the earth that nurtured them. Ember moved through this natural classroom with the particular attention of one who understood that they were being offered an education more valuable than any human wisdom could provide. Her songs, as she explored the valley's offerings, took on new complexities, melodies that seemed to carry conversations between human hope and earthly generosity, harmonies that translated human need into rhythms that the growing world could understand and respond to with enthusiasm rather than mere tolerance. She speaks the language of growing, Naya observed, watching as plants seemed to respond to Ember's presence by growing more vigorously, blooming more abundantly, offering their gifts more freely than they did, even in this valley of natural plenty. Where the child walked and sang, the earth itself seemed more alive, more willing to participate in the you as alive. Great experiment of cooperation between human intention and natural abundance. The decision to plant their first crop was made not from desperation but from curiosity, the desire to see what would happen when human planning worked with, rather than against, the forces that governed growth and abundance. They chose a section of the valley where the soil was particularly rich and the morning sun fell with gentle warmth throughout the growing season. With tools they had learned to craft from materials the warming world provided in abundance, they prepared the earth with movements that seemed more like dance than labor. The seeds they planted had been carried across the transforming world in carefully protected pouches, grains saved from the wild varieties they had encountered, roots that had proven particularly nourishing, flowering plants that seemed to attract the insects and birds whose presence marked healthy land. But as they placed these seeds in soil that welcomed them like long-lost children returning home, the planting became something larger than agriculture. It became an act of faith in the future, a declaration that the world had indeed changed fundamentally, that abundance was real and reliable enough to justify the investment of hope as well as labor. Ember sang to each seed as it was placed in the earth, her young voice somehow carrying melodies that spoke directly to the potential for life that slept within the tiny shells. Her songs seemed to awaken not just the seeds themselves but the soil that surrounded them, the water that would nourish them, the sunlight that would feed their growth. Where her voice touched the planted ground, the earth seemed to pulse with eagerness, as if it too had been waiting for this moment, when human intention and natural abundance could work together toward goals larger than either could achieve alone. The work of creating their first permanent shelter proceeded with the same sense of collaboration between human need and natural offering. The warming world provided materials in abundant: stones warmed by sun and shaped by water, wood from trees that had grown strong in the new abundance, clay that could be shaped into vessels, and bricks that would hold the warmth of their fires through the gentle nights of the warming world. But perhaps more importantly, they discovered that shelter in the abundant world could be beautiful as well as functional. Where survival in the ice world had demanded structures that prioritized protection above all other considerations. The warming world allowed them to create spaces that pleased the eye, as well as sheltering the body. They learned to arrange stones in patterns that caught and reflected light, to shape wood into curves that echoed the natural forms that surrounded them, to build in harmony with the landscape rather than in defense against it. As their settlement took shape around them, other families began to arrive, drawn by the smoke of their fires, the sound of embers singing, the rumors that spread among the scattered survivors of the Ice Age that somewhere a group had learned not just to survive in the warm world, but to flourish within it. These newcomers brought their own skills and their own dreams, their own seeds and tools and stories. And gradually, the single family's experiment in abundance became something larger and more complex. The first community any of them had known, where cooperation was based on plenty rather than scarcity, where sharing increased rather than depleted what was available to all. They learned together how to work with the seasons of abundance rather than against them, when to plant and when to harvest, how to preserve surplus for times when even abundance might be temporarily reduced, the ways to celebrate the gifts of the warming world that honored both the abundance itself and the long struggle that had led them to this place of plenty. Their celebrations became elaborate and beautiful, marked by music and food and storytelling that wove together their individual experiences into a shared narrative of transformation and hope. As the season progressed and their first crops reached toward harvest, they began to understand that they had succeeded in creating something unprecedented, a human settlement based on cooperation with abundance rather than competition for scarcity. The grains they had planted grew tall and full. The vegetables swelled with size and flavor that exceeded their most optimistic expectations, and the fruit trees they had carefully tended offered harvests that could feed not just their current community, but the larger settlements they could already envision, growing from the seeds of success they had planted in this fertile valley. On the evening before their first harvest, as the sun set behind grain fields that waved in the warm breeze like golden water, Ember stood among the plants that had responded so abundantly to human care and sang the song that would be remembered as the beginning of agriculture itself. Her voice carried gratitude to the earth that had proven so generous, to the seeds that had fulfilled their promise so completely, to the community that had learned to work in harmony with abundance rather than struggling against scarcity. In her song, the scattered survivors of the Ice Age heard the voice of the future, a promise that the warm world would support not just survival, but the flowering of human potential, in directions they were only beginning to imagine. They slept that night with the profound peace that comes from understanding that tomorrow's harvest would mark the beginning of abundance that could sustain not just their own lives, but the lives of children and grandchildren, countless generations yet to be born into a world where plenty rather than scarcity would be the foundation upon which human dreams were built. And so it was that in the fullness of time, when the harvest had filled their stores, beyond any measure their ancestors could have imagined, when the first permanent dwellings had been completed, and the smoke of cooking fires rose straight into air too gentle to disturb them, when children born in the warm world played games that would have been impossible in the realm of ice, the storyteller's voice began its final meditation, lifting away from the immediate concerns of daily life to soar across vistas of time that reduced individual existence to single notes in a symphony too vast for any one consciousness to hear in its entirety. From the height of this perspective, the transformation they had witnessed could be seen for what it truly was, not just the end of an ice age, but one movement in the Earth's eternal dance between cold and warmth, scarcity and abundance, the preservation that comes through freezing, and the flourishing that emerges when life is freed to explore its full potential. The glacier that had dominated their world was revealed as merely the most recent in a series of ice sheets that had advanced and retreated across countless millions of years, each one preserving life through harsh times and then releasing it into periods of abundance that allowed evolution to explore new forms of beauty and complexity. The painted caves they had discovered were themselves just the most recent layers in a palimpsest of human presence that stretched back through time spans that made their own ice age seem brief as a winter afternoon. Beneath the paintings they had found were older images, and beneath those were others older still. Each lay a testament to humans who had faced transformations as dramatic as their own, who had learned to adapt and survive, and eventually flourish as the world shifted around them through changes that must have seemed like the end of everything familiar. And yet life had persisted, had learned, had remembered across gaps of time that should have been long enough to erase all continuity. The seeds they had planted, carried within their genetic memory, the patterns of abundance that had flourished before the ice. Knowledge preserved, not in stories or artifacts, but in the very structure of life itself. The songs Ember sang to help them grow were themselves echoes of melodies that had been hummed by countless generations of humans who had learned to work in partnership with the Earth's fertility, rather than in opposition to its challenges. As the perspective of the storyteller's voice lifted higher still, expanding to encompass not just their own transformation, but the vast cycles of geological time that had shaped the Earth since its beginning, the family's journey could be seen as part of an even larger pattern. The warm world they had inherited was itself temporary, not in the sense that it would end soon, but in the understanding that all conditions were transitional, all abundances were gifts to be enjoyed and stewarded rather than possessions to be held forever. Yet this knowledge brought not despair, but profound peace. For if the ice would eventually return, then the wisdom they were accumulating about how to live in harmony with abundance was itself a form of preparation knowledge that would be preserved in some form through whatever changes were yet to come, ready to guide future generations when the world once again forgot winter and remembered how to bloom. The caves where ancient artists had painted visions of transformation would shelter new images, new stories, new forms of wisdom that would help unborn humans navigate transitions their current understanding could not even imagine. The children playing in their abundant valley carried within themselves the genetic legacy of all who had survived the long cold, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had faced the impossible and found ways not just to endure, but to emerge transformed. When they grew old enough to have children of their own, they would pass on not just the techniques of living with abundance, but the deeper understanding that all abundance was relationship, cooperation between human intention and forces larger than individual will, harmony between immediate need and long-term flourishing. Ember herself, as she grew from the child who had called the world back to warmth into the woman who would teach others how to live within that warmth, became something between individual person and living symbol of the Earth's capacity for renewal. Her songs, which had once been necessary to help her family navigate the chaos of transformation, evolved into the foundation of new forms of worship and celebration that honored the partnership between human consciousness and natural abundance, rather than pleading with hostile forces for temporary reprieve from suffering. But perhaps most importantly, as generations passed and the memory of ice faded from direct experience into stories told around fires that no longer served primarily for survival, but for the joy of sharing light and warmth with others, the understanding emerged that every human being carried within themselves both the survivor of ice ages and the beneficiary of abundance. Every person was born from the great melt, shaped by the long struggle between preservation and growth, marked by the particular beauty that comes from life that has learned to value both the careful conservation necessary for survival and the generous creativity possible when survival is assured. The cities that eventually grew from their first settlement, the technologies that emerged from their partnership with natural abundance, the art and music and literature that flowered when human energy was freed from the immediate demands of survival. All of these were revealed as expressions of the same fundamental understanding that Ember's first songs had carried, that the world was not fundamentally hostile to human flourishing, but rather a partner in the dance of consciousness, exploring its own possibilities through countless forms and countless generations of learning. And so, as the storyteller's voice finally began its gentle descent back toward the immediate present, toward the valley where the first harvest was being gathered, and the first permanent homes were sheltering families who had learned to trust in tomorrow's abundance, the transformation they had witnessed could be understood as both ending and beginning the completion of one great cycle of learning and the commencement of another, equally vast and equally beautiful adventure in the endless exploration of what it might mean to be alive in a universe that seemed, despite all evidence to the contrary, to favor the flourishing of consciousness over its extinction. The memory of ice would never be entirely forgotten, for it had shaped them too deeply to be erased by any amount of warmth. But that memory would be transformed, would become not trauma to be overcome, but wisdom to be treasured. The understanding that even the most challenging conditions could be survived, that even the longest winters eventually yielded to spring, that life itself was far more persistent and creative than any single generation's experience could encompass. "We are all born from the melt," the storyteller's voice whispered as consciousness began its final relaxation towards sleep. "We carry within ourselves the memory of ice and the promise of warmth, the wisdom of preservation and the joy of abundance, the patient endurance of winter and the exuberant creativity of spring. And in our dreams, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the sound of glaciers singing their farewell, the music of water flowing freely after its long imprisonment, the first songs of children who have never known scarcity, playing in valleys where flowers bloom in colors their ancestors had no names for, the sound of melting water faded gradually into the gentle patter of rain on leaves, then to the soft rhythm of breath growing slower and deeper, then to the profound silence from which all stories emerge and to which all stories return, carrying their listeners safely into the warm darkness where dreams flow like rivers towards seas of sleep deeper than any ice, more vast than any awakening, more gentle than the most tender lullaby ever sung by a mother to a child born into a world, learning to remember how to be kind. Sleep now, dream of warmth. The ice is gone, and the world is green again.